October 15, 1957, 2:17 a.m. The silence in Little Italy was broken by the sound of squealing tires and gunfire that would echo through the concrete canyons of Manhattan for the next 18 months. Vincent, the Chin Gigante, lay bleeding on Mulberry Street, 3 bullets from a .38 special embedded in his chest, gasping for air as his blood mixed with the autumn rain. But Vincent wasn't the target. The real target was sitting in a back room at Rao's restaurant, completely unaware that the most brutal war in organized crime history had just begun. His name was Frank Costello, and the man who ordered the hit wasn't Italian. He was a black man from Harlem who had just declared war on every crime family in New York City. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but the streets knew him as Bumpy, and what happened over the next 547 days would rewrite the rules of power in America forever. To understand the bloodbath that was about to unfold, you need to understand what Harlem meant in 1957. This wasn't just another neighborhood. This was a kingdom worth $23 million a year, and every penny of it flowed through one man's hands. Bumpy Johnson didn't just control Harlem's numbers racket. He was Harlem. When Mrs. Roosevelt needed groceries but couldn't afford them, Bumpy's people made sure her family ate. When white cops tried to shake down black business owners, one phone call from Bumpy made those cops disappear to different precincts. When Italian mobsters crossed 110th Street thinking they could muscle in on his territory, they left in ambulances or hearses. The choice was theirs. But by October of 1957, the 5 families had had enough. Carlo Gambino, Vincent Gigante, Thomas Lucchese, Joseph Prophesy, and Joseph Bonanno controlled every other inch of organized crime in New York. Every other inch except Harlem. And that drove them absolutely insane. Frank Costello, the most politically connected mob boss in America, had been trying to negotiate with Bumpy for 3 years. Every meeting ended the same way. Bumpy would lean back in his chair, light a Cuban cigar, and say 4 words that made Costello's blood boil. Harlem ain't for sale. The breaking point came on a humid Tuesday in September. Salvatore Sally Burns, Granello, one of Costello's most trusted enforcers, walked into the Lenox Lounge with 6 men. The message was simple. Pay tribute to the 5 families or face the consequences. Bumpy was sitting at his usual table in the back, reading the Amsterdam News while sipping whiskey. He didn't even look up when Sally approached. "Mr. Johnson," Sally said, his Brooklyn accent thick and menacing. "Mr. Costello sent me to discuss a business arrangement." Bumpy folded his newspaper carefully, placed it on the table, and finally looked up. "Tell Mr. Costello I said to kiss my black ass," he replied calmly. "And tell him I said it in front of witnesses." The room went dead silent. Every person in that lounge knew they had just witnessed a declaration of war. Sally's hand moved toward his jacket, but before he could draw his weapon, 12 of Bumpy's men had guns pointed at his head. The message was clear. This was Bumpy's house, and anyone who forgot that would be carried out in a box. Sally and his crew backed out slowly, but everyone knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Vincent Gigante was lying in his own blood on Mulberry Street, and the most vicious gang war in American history was underway. But what made this war different wasn't just the body count, though by the time it ended, 36 men would be dead. What made it different was that for the first time in American history, a black man was going toe-to-toe with the Italian-American Mafia and winning. Bumpy Johnson had been preparing for this war his entire life. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, he'd been shipped to Harlem as a teenager after getting into trouble with the law. But Harlem in the 1920s wasn't the organized territory it would become. It was chaos. Numbers runners worked for whoever paid them the most. Protection rackets overlapped and competed. Drug dealers fought bloody turf wars on every corner. Young Ellsworth Johnson saw the chaos and saw opportunity. By 1930, at just 25 years old, Bumpy had done something no one thought possible. He'd united Harlem's criminal enterprises under one umbrella. His umbrella. He didn't do it through violence alone, though he was certainly capable of that. He did it through something the Italian families never understood. Community. When the Great Depression hit and Harlem families couldn't afford food, Bumpy's numbers runners made sure they ate. When white landlords tried to evict black families during the worst economic crisis in American history, mysterious fires started breaking out in those landlords' other properties. When the police harassed local businesses, those same officers found their patrol cars vandalized and their home addresses published in the Amsterdam News. By 1940, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal. He was a folk hero. Mothers named their children after him. Preachers, though they never admitted publicly, quietly thanked God for him. Politicians, both black and white, sought his endorsement. And most importantly, every person involved in organized crime in Harlem owed their living to him. This network of loyalty would prove crucial when the war began. The first body dropped on October 18, 1957, just 3 days after Vincent Gigante's shooting. Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno, one of the Genovese family's most feared enforcers, was found floating in the East River with 3 bullet holes in his skull. The message tied to his ankle read simply, "Stay out of Harlem. B.J." Frank Costello was apoplectic. No one had dared to kill a made man and leave a calling card since the days of Al Capone. The 5 families called an emergency meeting at the Appalachian Estate in upstate New York. 58 of the most powerful criminals in America gathered on November 14, 1957 to discuss one topic: how to eliminate Bumpy Johnson. Carlo Gambino argued for a massive coordinated strike. "We hit every one of his operations simultaneously," he said, chain-smoking cigarettes while pacing the room. "Numbers, protection, drugs, everything. We burn Harlem to the ground and rebuild it in our image." Joseph Prophesy disagreed. "This Johnson has too much political protection. Half the judges in Manhattan owe their careers to him. We need to be surgical. Take him out quietly and let his organization crumble." But Thomas Lucchese, the most strategically minded of the 5 bosses, saw the real problem. "You're all thinking about this wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't about territory. This isn't about money. This is about respect. A black man just looked the 5 families in the eye and told us to go to hell. If we don't respond with overwhelming force, every other ethnic gang in the city is going to think they can challenge us too. The Irish in Brooklyn, the Jews on the Lower East Side, the Puerto Ricans in the Bronx. We let Bumpy Johnson live, and we'll be fighting wars on 6 fronts within a year." The decision was unanimous. Bumpy Johnson had to die, and his death had to send a message that would echo through the underworld for generations. They allocated $2 million and 50 men to the task. It would take them 18 months to spend every penny and lose every man. The war escalated quickly after Appalachian. On December 3, 1957, 2 of Bumpy's numbers runners were found murdered in an alley behind the Apollo Theater. Their killers had carved the word, "tribute," into their foreheads. Bumpy's response came 72 hours later. Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Massino, one of Bonanno's top lieutenants, was gunned down outside his social club in Brooklyn. But Bumpy didn't just kill him. He made sure Massino's body was found wearing women's clothing and makeup, the ultimate insult in Italian-American culture. By Christmas of 1957, the streets of Manhattan were running red with blood. The newspapers couldn't keep up with the body count. Police Commissioner Stephen Kennedy held daily press conferences begging both sides to end the violence, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. This wasn't just about territory anymore. It had become personal. The turning point came in February of 1958 with an event that would become legendary in underworld circles. The 5 families had finally identified what they thought was Bumpy's weakness. His adopted daughter, Ruthie Johnson, was a student at Barnard College. She was brilliant, beautiful, and completely innocent of her father's criminal activities. The plan was simple. Kidnap Ruthie, demand that Bumpy surrender himself and disband his organization, then kill them both to send the ultimate message about what happened to people who challenged the 5 families. On February 14, Valentine's Day, 4 men grabbed Ruthie as she left her literature class. They bundled her into a black Cadillac and drove to a warehouse in Queens where she was held for 3 days while the families crafted their ransom demand. What they didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had been expecting this move for months. He'd had Ruthie followed by bodyguards since the war began, bodyguards who were specifically trained in one skill: following kidnappers without being detected. While the families thought they were in control, Bumpy spent those 3 days turning their perfect plan into their worst nightmare. He didn't just locate the warehouse where Ruthie was being held. He identified every person involved in the kidnapping, every safe house they used, every family member they cared about. And then he began the most methodical and brutal campaign of psychological warfare in criminal history. On the morning of February 17th, Joseph Prophesy woke up to find his grandson's severed finger nailed to his front door with a note. "You have my daughter. I have your grandson. The difference is you know where my daughter is. You'll never find your grandson." Prophesy's grandson was actually safe in a boarding school in Connecticut, but Prophesy didn't know that. All he knew was that the boy had disappeared and Bumpy Johnson had his finger. The same morning, Carlo Gambino found his wife's wedding ring in his coffee cup with a note that read, "She's watching you eat breakfast. Can you see her?" Gambino's wife was actually visiting her sister in New Jersey, but when Gambino called to check on her, the phone just rang and rang. Again, Bumpy's people had simply intercepted the phone calls, but the psychological effect was devastating. Thomas Lucchese found his prize racehorse dead in its stable, its throat cut, and the words, "Your turn," written in blood on the stable wall. Joseph Bonanno's restaurant was burned to the ground, with every door and window welded shut from the outside, making it look like someone had tried to burn the people inside alive. By February 18th, all 5 family heads were barricaded in their homes with dozens of bodyguards, jumping at every shadow, fearing for the lives of everyone they loved. That's when Bumpy made his move. He walked into the warehouse where Ruthie was being held with just 2 men, his longtime bodyguard Big Sam Foster and his enforcer Frank Lucas. The 4 kidnappers never had a chance. Within minutes, all 4 were dead, and Ruthie was safe. But Bumpy wasn't finished. He left one kidnapper alive long enough to deliver a message to the 5 families. "Tell your bosses that Bumpy Johnson is coming for all of them. Tell them that every day they continue this war, someone they love is going to disappear. Tell them that the only way this ends is with them dead or gone. There is no negotiation. There is no compromise. There is only surrender or death." The psychological warfare had worked. The 5 families, men who had never shown fear in their entire lives, were terrified. They tried to break Bumpy Johnson by threatening his family, and instead he'd shown them that no one they cared about was safe. The war shifted from the streets to a series of increasingly desperate assassination attempts. Over the next 8 months, the families sent their best killers after Bumpy. Professional hitmen from Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia were brought in with one job: kill Bumpy Johnson by any means necessary. But every attempt failed, often spectacularly. Bumpy seemed to know about every plot before it was even fully formed. He knew which restaurants to avoid, which routes to take, which bodyguards might be compromised. It was as if he could read minds. The truth was simpler and more devastating. Bumpy Johnson had done something the 5 families thought was impossible. He'd infiltrated their organizations. For every assassin they sent after him, he had someone inside their operation feeding him information. The bellhop at the hotel where they held their meetings was on Bumpy's payroll. The cook at their favorite restaurant was reporting their every conversation. Even some of their own soldiers, tired of the endless war and impressed by Bumpy's tactical brilliance, had switched sides. By September of 1958, the 5 families were in complete disarray. They'd lost 31 men to Bumpy's 5. Their operations were being disrupted constantly by police raids that seemed to be perfectly timed to catch them with evidence. Their political protection was evaporating as judges and politicians, either bought or intimidated by Bumpy's people, began distancing themselves from Italian organized crime. For the first time in their history, the 5 families were losing a war. That's when they made their final, desperate play. If they couldn't kill Bumpy Johnson through strategy or superior numbers, they'd kill him through betrayal. They'd turn someone so close to him, someone he trusted so completely, that he'd never see the betrayal coming. They'd turned Big Sam Foster. Samuel Foster had been Bumpy's bodyguard and closest friend for 5 years. He'd taken 2 bullets protecting Bumpy. He'd killed at least 6 men in Bumpy's service. He'd been the best man at Bumpy's wedding and the godfather to his children. If anyone could get close enough to Bumpy to put a bullet in his head, it was Big Sam. The family's approach was masterful in its simplicity. They didn't threaten Sam's life. They threatened something more valuable: his mother's life. Ethel Foster was 73 years old and lived in a small apartment in the Bronx. She'd worked as a cleaning lady her entire life and had never hurt anyone. The message delivered to Sam was clear: kill Bumpy Johnson, or watch your mother die slowly and painfully. For 3 weeks, Big Sam agonized over the impossible choice. Kill the man who'd been like a brother to him, or let his innocent mother be tortured to death. He tried to find a third option, tried to think of a way to save both Bumpy and his mother, but the families had planned this perfectly. They had Ethel Foster under constant surveillance. Any attempt to rescue her would result in her immediate death. Finally, Sam made his choice. On the night of October 12, 1958, he agreed to take the contract. The plan was simple. Walk into the Lenox Lounge where Bumpy held court every Sunday night. Wait for the perfect moment when Bumpy's attention was elsewhere. 1 shot to the back of the head. Collect the $50,000 payment and disappear forever. What Big Sam didn't know, what none of the 5 families suspected, was that Bumpy Johnson had been expecting this betrayal for months. He'd known about every approach the families had made to his inner circle. He'd known about every attempt to turn his people. And he'd known about the threat to Ethel Foster 3 hours after it was made. The night of October 12th, Big Sam walked into the Lenox Lounge with his heart breaking and his hands shaking. Bumpy was at his usual table, his back to the door, seemingly vulnerable. Sam approached slowly, his hand on the grip of his .38 special. He drew the weapon, aimed it at the back of Bumpy's head, and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. The gun was empty. Bumpy turned around slowly, looked Sam dead in the eyes, and spoke 5 words that would become legend in criminal circles. "I've been counting on you." Then he smiled, that enigmatic smile that had intimidated and charmed people for decades. "Sit down, Sam. We need to talk." What happened next would be talked about in underworld circles for generations. Bumpy Johnson had known about the plot against Big Sam's mother for 3 weeks, just as he'd known about every other move the 5 families had made. But instead of stopping it, he'd used it. While Sam thought he was betraying Bumpy to save his mother, Bumpy's people had already rescued Ethel Foster and hidden her in a safe house in Philadelphia. The woman the families thought they were holding was actually an actress, paid to play the part of a kidnapped elderly woman. But the deception went even deeper. Bumpy had given Sam an empty gun deliberately, knowing that when Sam pulled the trigger on an empty chamber, it would be the perfect moment to spring the trap that would end the war once and for all. Because while Big Sam was walking into the Lenox Lounge to commit what he thought was murder, 50 of Bumpy's best men were simultaneously hitting every safe house, every social club, and every business owned by the 5 families throughout New York City. The coordinated strike was devastating in its precision and brutality. Frank Costello was gunned down outside his apartment building on the Upper West Side. Carlo Gambino was found dead in his car with 17 bullet wounds. Thomas Lucchese was killed while eating dinner with his family at a restaurant in Little Italy. Joseph Prophesy died in his bed, shot through his bedroom window by a sniper. Joseph Bonanno, the only one who survived the initial assault, fled New York and never returned. By dawn on October 13, 1958, the war was over. The 5 families that had controlled organized crime in New York for decades were leaderless and broken. Their operations were in chaos, their soldiers scattered to the wind, their political protection gone. And in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson sat in his office reading the morning newspapers, which described the bloodiest night in organized crime history as a gang war that eliminated the leadership of 5 major criminal organizations. The final body count was 36 dead, just as the newspapers reported, but the real victory wasn't measured in corpses. It was measured in power. For the first time in American history, the Italian-American Mafia's grip on organized crime had been broken by an outsider, and that outsider was a black man from Harlem who'd proven that intelligence, loyalty, and strategic thinking could triumph over tradition, numbers, and brutality. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire war was what Bumpy Johnson did with his victory. He didn't try to expand into Italian territory. He didn't seek revenge against the surviving members of the five families. He simply returned to Harlem and continued doing what he'd always done: protecting his community, running his numbers racket, and making sure that anyone who wanted to do business in his neighborhood did so on his terms. The war between Bumpy Johnson and the Italian Mafia became legend, but its true significance was only understood years later. It marked the beginning of the end of Italian-American dominance in organized crime and the rise of a new generation of criminal leaders who came from different backgrounds and operated by different rules. It proved that the supposedly unbreakable code of the Mafia could be broken by someone who understood that real power doesn't come from fear alone, but from the combination of fear and respect, violence and compassion, strategic thinking and unwavering loyalty to the community you serve. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. 10 years after his victory over the five families, but the lessons of his war lived on. Every criminal organization that followed studied his tactics. Every leader who rose in the aftermath of the Mafia's decline understood that the rules had changed forever. The war that began with Vincent Gigante bleeding on Mulberry Street and ended with 5 mob bosses dead in one night had rewritten the rules of power in America, and the man who'd rewritten them was a quiet, intelligent, absolutely ruthless protector of Harlem who'd proven that in the world of organized crime, the smartest man always wins, regardless of the color of his skin or the neighborhood he calls home. The ripple effects of Bumpy Johnson's revolution extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of that bloody night in 1958. In the months that followed, as news of the five families' decimation spread through the criminal underworld, something unprecedented began to happen across America's urban landscape. Criminal organizations that had operated under the old Italian model for decades suddenly found themselves vulnerable, their protection rackets exposed, their territorial boundaries meaningless in the face of a new kind of warfare that prioritized intelligence networks over brute force. In Chicago, the outfit's grip on the South Side began to weaken as local operators, inspired by Johnson's success, started forming their own independent networks. These weren't crude gang takeovers, but sophisticated operations that mirrored Bumpy's integration of legitimate business, community support, and strategic violence. The old bosses, who had grown comfortable in their insulated world of Italian-only hierarchies, found themselves outmaneuvered by leaders who understood that power in America's changing cities required cultural fluency across racial and ethnic lines. What made Johnson's victory particularly devastating to the traditional Mafia structure was how completely it exposed their fundamental weakness: their insularity. For generations, the five families had maintained power through exclusion, keeping their operations within tight-knit Italian-American communities, trusting only blood relatives and paesani from the old country. This insularity had been their strength in the early decades of the 20th century, when ethnic enclaves provided natural barriers against law enforcement and rival organizations. But by the 1950s, as America's cities became increasingly diverse and interconnected, this same insularity had become a fatal blindness. Johnson understood what the Mafia bosses had failed to grasp: that real power in modern urban America required building bridges across every community, every ethnic group, every economic class. His network included not just African American numbers runners and enforcers, but Irish American police contacts, Jewish American legitimate businessmen, Italian American smugglers who had grown tired of the family's rigid hierarchies, and even Puerto Rican and Cuban immigrants who were beginning to establish their own criminal enterprises. This diversity wasn't just a matter of inclusive leadership. It was a strategic necessity that gave Johnson access to information and opportunities that the ethnically homogeneous Mafia families could never match. The intelligence network that had made Johnson's victory possible continued to evolve and expand after 1958, becoming a template for criminal organizations across the country. Former associates of Johnson began establishing similar networks in Detroit, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, always with the same core principle: power comes not from controlling territory through fear alone, but from becoming indispensable to the communities you operate within. They opened legitimate businesses that provided real services and employment, they mediated disputes that the official justice system ignored, and they maintained strict codes of conduct that prohibited the kind of civilian casualties that had made the Mafia increasingly unpopular with ordinary residents. Perhaps most importantly, Johnson's victory demonstrated that the federal government's approach to organized crime had been fundamentally flawed. For decades, law enforcement had focused almost exclusively on the Italian-American families, treating them as the primary threat to public safety while largely ignoring the complex web of criminal enterprises that existed in every major American city. The FBI's obsession with the Mafia, driven partly by J. Edgar Hoover's personal vendetta against Italian-American crime bosses, had created enormous blind spots that allowed non-Italian criminal organizations to flourish. Johnson's network had operated for years under this umbrella of federal indifference, growing stronger and more sophisticated while law enforcement resources remained focused on traditional Mafia activities. When the five families finally fell, federal agents found themselves facing a criminal landscape they barely understood, populated by organizations that didn't fit their established patterns of investigation and prosecution. The old wiretaps and informant networks that had been so effective against the insulting Mafia families proved almost useless against Johnson's diverse, community-integrated operations.